Hey YouTube! This is the Venom Samurai. That's right, I am doing it without a mask on. Hi! You know, I know I told you guys that if we got 100 views on the last one, that I would do my next one without the mask. Well, sadly, you guys aren't viewing my videos. So, if this is just for me, fine. This is a rant that I really wanted to record. Because this is kind of my take on horror movie sequels. You know, I talked about a horror movie and a little bit about the horror movie genre in the last one. This time I'm going to talk about horror movie sequels and the way that I think they should work. So, to start off with, I want to talk about horror movies, the genre, and what they get when they get what I call sequelitis. You know, because they start out, they get about maybe 2 or 3 sequels in, and then they start belching out sequels like it's candy. Take, for example, you know, of course, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, the Child's Play movies, Halloween, dear God. You know, the mainstays of horror, the horror slasher movies. Slasher movies are even worse to do this than most other horror movies. Now you're starting to see it in things like Paranormal Activity. You know, we're starting to see more and more, not necessarily sequels, but kind of prequel-esque stuff. But getting into my rant, I personally believe, in my heart, I personally believe that if you're gonna make sequels to a movie, you have 2 options in doing it. Option number 1, you make 3 sequels to a base movie. Let's look at it like you're building a wall. That's a good visual for everybody. Let's look at it as if you're building a wall. First off is your first movie. That's your base. And it's sitting on solid ground. Now, if it's a good movie, that wall is not going to budge. If it's a bad movie, falls over, no more sequels, done deal. Now, this is where we start getting into things. So, your movie does well, so you make a second movie, which doesn't add quite as much as the first one does. I'll use it like this so that you guys can kind of get a better visual. I know I'm using my hands, but again, this is all done in my room, not done with any special editing or any of that sort of shit. Like I said, if I knew anything about editing, I would be making better videos. But we'll just go with what we got. This is an easier visual to do it with anyway. So, we have our base movie, right? You got four strands there holding that base movie. It's a solid movie. Well, then comes along your sequel, and that only adds about 3 strands to it. Gives it a little bit more substance, but not quite as much as the first one. Now your wall's going to wiggle a little bit, but it's not going to fall. Then comes along your second sequel. And that only adds about 2 strands. Well, now your wall's getting a little bit more wiggly. It's not falling over because your wall's still on solid ground. Then you get the third sequel. This is where I think all horror movies should stop. Because once you hit that third sequel, once you hit number 4 in a movie series, that's when your series has pretty much just done everything. And it's time to end your series at that point. Case in point, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the whole idea, those of you who have never seen a Friday the 13th movie, as few of you out there as I'm sure there are, let me break this down for you. The first movie is good, okay? The first movie is Jason's not the killer. Let's just make that clear. Jason is not the killer. We've all seen Scream. We all know the rules. Jason is not the killer in the first movie. It's his mother. The second movie, Jason becomes your killer. That's where things are added to it. He's given, he's afraid to show his face, and he's got all this mysterious mojo going on around him. Now that adds to the mythos, but not as much as the first movie did. Because we're talking about a new character. Of course it's not going to add as much as the first movie did. We're not explaining Mrs. Voorhees. We're explaining Jason. Well, then comes along your third movie. Now, your third movie in Friday the 13th is iconic because that's when Jason gets his signature hockey mask. But other than that, it's really not all that different from number 2. It's basically rinse and repeat. It's just now, instead of a potato sack over his head, it's now the hockey mask, the iconic, we all know Jason Voorhees' hockey mask now. Now, after that movie, they initially decided, we're just going to kill Jason off. We're going to end Friday the 13th, which would have been fine with me, because then we wouldn't have had to live through the fake-out fright in Friday 5. Because they killed him. They killed Jason Voorhees in number 4. Just leave him dead. I know I'm going to upset a few hundred Jason fans out there, but I just want to say this to you guys. I mean, really, it would be okay if they gave some sort of an explanation as to why Jason is able to keep coming back from the dead. The best explanation I've ever gotten, if you can find this comic book, I highly recommend that you pick it up. It was a comic project that has been kicked around forever, and it's an idea that's been kicked around forever. It's basically Freddy versus Jason versus the Army of Darkness. And it's basically Freddy versus Jason versus Ashley Williams. You'll have to pardon me, I'm not very good at doing threes outside of doing it like this. I have a bad finger issue. I don't know what it is. It's been with me since birth. But either way, getting back to my point, we have no explanation for why Jason keeps coming back to life. So, we can't really get behind that. Now, a lot of you would say, oh, well, in, the Nightmare on Elm Streets, there's a reason for Freddy to keep coming back. Well, yeah, but at that point, after about movie number 4, is when Nightmare stopped being so much scary and started being more funny. I mean, let's be honest here, folks. If we're honest, nobody watches Nightmare on Elm Street for the terror that's felt by the kids. Nobody watches any of these subsequent Nightmare on Elm Streets to be scared. They watch those to get a good laugh out of a very good antagonist. He's actually become kind of an anti-hero if you think about it. But getting back to my point, it's always after that 4th movie that the series really starts to kind of go downhill. Those who are fans of the latter half of those movie franchises, you know, I'm sorry. I understand where you're coming from. And from a different point of view, from a non-horror based point of view, those movies are actually pretty decent. But they're not horror movies. I'm sorry. They're not horror movies. Because the kills have stopped being scary. Case in point. In the first movie, the most notable kill that everybody talks about is the arrow through Kevin Bacon's neck. Hey, that was an inventive kill. We'd never seen that before in a murder mystery. So there was a lot more grit and gruesomeness to that. Then we move on to Friday the 13th, number 8. Now this is 8 movies. This is 7 sequels later. What's the most notable scene that most people get out of that? Jason walking down the street and he kicks the guy's boombox. That's not a horror movie, people. That's something you'd see in a movie like Airplane. You know, or maybe a Mel Brooks movie, you know? That's comedy. That's not really horror. Nightmare on Elm Street, case in point. Most notable kill out of the first Nightmare on Elm Street, Johnny Depp getting eaten by the bed. You know, that was something we'd never seen before. That was something edgy. But you see, by the 8th movie, which, if I'm counting correctly, you'll have to pardon me. I tend to not remember numbers in these very well. But by about... by Freddy's Dead, you know, you have a guy getting killed in a video game. It's funny. And it's inventive, but it's not so much scary because it's not like say, the scene out of Twilight Zone, the movie, where the girl gets sucked into the TV because of the little boy, and she's chased around by cartoon monsters, and then is suddenly swallowed by one. You know, it's not like that kind of, you know, mind-blowing sort of scenario. Because, you know, video games were cool, you know, and all Freddy does throughout the entire scene is spout modern catchphrases. Whoa, good graphics. Now I'm playing with power. You know? That's the kind of shit that you put in a damn Nintendo commercial. You know, that's not Freddy Krueger. But I could go on with that, but, you know, once it gets past that 4th sequel, it's kind of just bleh. It's not a horror movie after that point, because it just slowly degrades into comedy. Now, I mentioned before that there was 2 options. I told you about the first option. That's what I was just talking about. Now we go to the second option. I'll go like this, Joe. I'm not going like this because, you know, I don't want to offend my friends in England. But the second option is, instead of doing 3 sequels, you instead do 2 sequels and a prequel. Now, bear in mind, I am aware that there are horror movie prequels out there. And more times out than not, they're not overtly good. But the plus shot to those is that the prequels make us appreciate the original so much more. You know, as bad bad as a prequel can be, you appreciate that original movie so much more. Think about that for a second. You know, when you watched, let's say, oh, I don't know, Halloween. Granted, we didn't really appreciate Michael Myers. But then, Rob Zombie comes out with his version, where we get a little bit of backstory on Michael Myers. You know, he's this troubled kid who he feels these urges and he doesn't know how to exercise them. And then one night he finally just snaps and he goes off and kills his entire family except for his little baby sister. That makes us appreciate Michael Myers more. You know, and then in the subsequent sequels, really with that they should have... Halloween's kind of a special case because they initially did not want Halloween to be all about Michael Myers, and to be honest, I really agree with them on that. It shouldn't have been all about Michael Myers. You had 2 movies with this guy. That's fine, because technically the second movie is just a continuation of the first movie. So we've run that gamut. We've run that gamut of stuff right there. And they should have stopped with Michael Myers at that point. But, now there's a but coming. Had they continued on number 3 with Michael Myers, I would have personally, if I was John Carpenter, and Mr. Carpenter, if you happen to see this, yeah, I want to say up front that you did an awesome job of introducing the slasher movie, but you should have given him a little bit more backstory, man. Just a little bit more, you know, just teensy bit. Because, granted, it's his anonymity that makes him scary, but, damn it, you need to make these characters timeless, you know? The reason why characters like Superman, Batman, you know, The Flash, Wonder Woman, all the superheroes and all the supervillains are timeless and they will never really die is because they're understood by their audience. Slashers need to be understood by their audience too. You know, whenever you go back into slasher movie history, you notice that all of them have a tragic backstory. There's a reason why they're doing all this. With Michael Myers, there was no reason for him to be doing any of this. He was just crazy. Which is fine. I mean, he can be just crazy. But that's not what the audience wants to see, necessarily. No, back in the 70s and back in the early 80s, that was cutting edge, you know, just to have that kind of a character. But now people want some meat to their bone, you know. They don't want just the soup bone. They want the little bit hunk of ham that's hanging off the edge to go with it. Something for them to chew on and really enjoy before they start chewing on that bone. But getting back to what I was saying, it's like building our wall again. You know, here's our base. Then you have your first sequel. Then you have your second sequel. Okay, when you stop right here, and you say, well, you know what, that base isn't really on solid ground. Let's go down there, and let's pull the wall over for a second. Let's dig underneath it, and put a base down in the ground, and then put that wall, plus the 2 subsequent sections we've added, on top of it. That makes it a much more solid wall. Can that wall still fall over? Absolutely. But it's less likely to. And why? Because people will understand it. Now, lately, we haven't seen a lot of horror sequels. We've seen more, I want to say we see reimaginings. You know, we have Paranormal Activity, typical haunted house movie. But then you have The Asylum, then you have The Orphanage, then you have all these ghost story movies popping up. Ghosts are becoming more scary now, which is great. You know, I personally love a good ghost story more than I do a slasher movie. Because slashers have kind of become passé. You know, it's not like back in the old days where a slasher was, a slasher. Or, going back to the very first slasher movie, Psycho. Yes, that was the very first slasher movie. I defy anybody to say otherwise. Guys, Alfred Hitchcock, you are the man. In Psycho, nobody could have fathomed somebody doing something like this. Now we see it every other day. I mean, we see scarier shit on Law and Order SVU than we do in most 80s horror movies. Most 80s slasher movies. Let me rephrase that. Not most 80s horror movies. Most 80s slasher movies. But now people are starting to get more and more into ghost stories. With things like The Conjuring. And the rare ghost story reimagining prequel, Annabelle. Jesus fucking Christ, I will not watch Annabelle alone. If my girlfriend happens to see this, you're coming over, you're watching it with me. She's just as much of a horror nut as I am. I watched The Conjuring alone and I was looking over my shoulder for the rest of the day. I will openly admit that movie freaked me out, okay? And it was just the way that it was told. James Wan of Saw fame, guy who did a slasher movie. And technically you can't call Saw a slasher, but I'm not going to get off on that tangent. I'm on this tangent right now. In horror, it's one thing if you're telling a story about the same character over and over and over and over and over again. And not just in horror, but in any genre of movie. It's one thing if you keep telling the story about the same character over and over and over and over and over again. Because when you keep focusing on the same character, he kind of loses a little bit of his punch. Well, case in point. Let's go outside of horror. Let's go to a genre everybody loves, superhero movies. Let's go to Superman. You have Christopher Reeve. Christopher Reeve in that first Superman movie. He was awesome. He was strong. He was great. Then you had Superman 2. He was fighting other Kryptonians and he was a lot cooler. But then you had Superman 3. Dear Christ, why did we have Superman 3? And then Superman 4. Nail in the coffin. But then everybody's going to say, oh, but then they had Superman Returns. Drive that nail a little bit deeper there, folks. Superman Returns is to movies what kryptonite is to Superman, okay? And I'm sorry if people liked it. I'm sorry. It's not a bad movie to just watch and turn your brain off, but it's really not that good. I'm sorry, it's not. But I'm getting off track again. Let me get back on track. Basically, with horror movies, we need sequels to be limited to 3s. You're only allowed 3 sequels or 2 sequels and a prequel. And after that, if you want to continue the series, continue it with a different character. Don't continue it with a character that people know. Now, mind you, don't continue it with a character that people know. And when I say that, don't pull some bullshit like Scream did, where in the first movie it was that guy, then in the second movie it was his mother, and the third movie, you know, it was some other jackass. I can't remember right off the top of my head. But, you know, don't pull shit like that where it's the son of so-and-so, or the brother of so-and-so, or the family member of so-and-so. Nobody gives a shit about Jason Voorhees' step-uncle twice removed. You know? Nobody wants to see Halloween, the family reunion show. Nobody wants to see that. Now, if you want to make a movie that is non-horror and have this be more along the lines of a crossover, kind of like what we saw with Freddy vs. Jason. I will openly admit that Freddy vs. Jason is fun to watch, but it's not a horror movie. I'm sorry. I know I'm going to piss off a certain group of people in tight yellow pants. But it's not a horror movie. It's a comedy. It's an episode of Scooby-Doo. Let me put it that way. It's an episode of Scooby-Doo. It's trying to be scary, but it's really not, and it's more kiddie than any of the rest of them. I mean, for fuck's sake, we have a guy who he dies by having Freddy right on his back, burn into his back, Freddy's back. Okay, now you're getting into Scooby-Doo territory. If I want to watch a Scooby-Doo episode starring Jason Voorhees, I'll watch Robot Chicken, okay? Because they actually did that. They did an episode of Robot Chicken where it was Scooby-Doo Goes to Camp Blood, which is really great. If you ever get the chance to watch it, watch it. But, the thing about horror sequels, guys, if you're going to do a crossover, don't make it a horror movie. Make it, just do kind of like what you did with Freddy vs. Jason, you know, make it kind of a Scooby-Doo-esque thing. That way it's enjoyable, it's brain candy, you know, it makes your brain feel fine, it gives your brain a happy feeling to watch, because you're seeing your two favorite slashers go at each other. I know there's been the idea kicked around for Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash for years. Look up that comic book, by the way. There are two actual versions. There are two comics. There's Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash, and there's Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash Nightmare Warriors, in which Jason actually gets brought back to life by, like, really brought back to life. And it actually gives an explanation for why he is the way he is. But you know, that's where I'm going with this whole review. Or not really review, it's more of a rant. I'll say rant. You know what, that's what you guys like to see. I'll go into rant. But you know, I've done 2 horror rants lately. So the next one I'll do on my favorite subject, which is something very near and dear to a lot of people, is Doctor Who. Now, to clarify, I will not be doing Doctor Who the first Doctor. I will not be focusing on the 1st through the 8th Doctor. I will be focusing mainly on the 9th through the 12th Doctor, because those are the Doctors that I was introduced to. I didn't actually come across the 1st Doctor until after I had watched all of seasons 9, 10, 11, and 12. So, with that said, well, I'm the Venom Samurai. Hi! I know you guys, I've said this a million times before, I don't think it needs to be said again. No trolling, you know, why troll? Trolling is not is not cool. You know, you're just making people angry to make yourself feel better, and you know that says a lot more about you than it does about the people that you're making angry. So that's all for this edition. I'll see you guys again next time, and we'll have another Venom Samurai rant. Good night, all.